The medal surfaced first, its bronze eagle still visible beneath 2 centuries of frozen mud, and for a few seconds nobody at the excavation site said a word. The wind moved quietly across the empty field as one of the archaeologists brushed away another layer of dirt with trembling hands, revealing the corner of a rotting wooden box, buried less than 3 feet beneath the ground. Inside were objects that should not have been there. A cracked officer's compass, silver coins stamped with Napoleon's imperial crest, fragments of a regimental flag wrapped in decayed cloth, and a handwritten note so faded that only a few words could still be read. What stunned historians was not simply the age of the discovery. It was the fact that these relics appeared to have been hidden deliberately, carefully arranged beneath the soil by soldiers who likely believed they would one day return for them. But they never did. For more than 200 years, the secret remained untouched beneath the earth, while empires rose and vanished above it. And the deeper researchers looked into the story, the stranger it became. Because this was not just a forgotten cache of military equipment abandoned during battle. According to surviving records, several French soldiers disappeared in this exact region during one of Napoleon's most disastrous campaigns, vanishing during a brutal retreat that turned roads into graveyards of shattered wagons, starving horses, and exhausted men marching through endless snow. Official reports from the time claimed the army lost supplies during the chaos, but local villagers passed down a very different story for generations. They spoke of French soldiers digging into the frozen ground late at night under torchlight, while distant cannon fire echoed across the hills. They claimed the men buried something important before disappearing into the darkness forever. Most historians dismiss those stories as folklore, until now. Because when the excavation team expanded the dig site, they uncovered evidence suggesting the relics were hidden with extraordinary purpose. The objects were stacked carefully, protected beneath layers of cloth and timber, as if the soldiers wanted them preserved, not abandoned. Even stranger, several items appeared connected to an elite regiment attached directly to Napoleon's main forces during the retreat. That discovery opened an entirely new question. What exactly were these soldiers trying to protect? Was it money? Military intelligence? Regimental honors? Or something far more personal, hidden during the final collapse of an empire that once controlled most of Europe? Tonight, we are going to uncover the forgotten story behind these buried war relics, the desperate retreat that led to their disappearance, and the mystery that remained hidden beneath frozen soil for more than 2 centuries. And the truth behind what happened to the men who buried them may be far darker than historians originally believed. If you enjoy exploring hidden stories like this, stories buried beneath battlefields, lost empires, and forgotten wars, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think those soldiers were trying to hide before they vanished into history. December of 1812 arrived like the end of the world for the remnants of Napoleon's army. The snow along the retreat roads had turned gray beneath thousands of boots, broken wagon wheels, and the remains of horses that had collapsed from exhaustion in temperatures that sometimes dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit during the night. Entire units that had marched proudly into Russia only months earlier were now reduced to scattered columns of starving men wrapped in torn coats and frozen blankets. The empire that once terrified Europe no longer looked invincible. It looked hunted. By the time the French forces moved westward after abandoning Moscow, discipline was beginning to disappear. Officers struggled to hold formations together while supply wagons vanished into the endless winter storms. Many soldiers had not eaten properly in days. Others marched with strips of cloth tied around their feet because their boots had fallen apart somewhere along the frozen roads east of Smolensk. Yet even as the army collapsed around them, certain men were still guarding specific objects with almost obsessive determination. According to surviving military journals discovered decades later in French archives, several officers attached to an elite regimental convoy were ordered to transport items considered too valuable to abandon during the retreat. Historians originally assumed these were financial reserves or ceremonial military objects, but the newly discovered relics suggested something far more personal may have been involved. Witness accounts from local villagers described exhausted French troops arriving near a wooded hillside shortly after sunset. Fires were kept low to avoid detection. Horses were hidden beneath tree cover. No drums were beaten that night. No camp songs echoed through the freezing air. Instead, small groups of soldiers carried wooden crates away from the main road under strict supervision, while others stood watch, facing the dark horizon, where distant flashes of artillery still lit the sky. One villager later wrote that the men appeared terrified someone was following them. At first glance, that fear made sense. Russian cavalry patrols were moving closer every day, and thousands of retreating soldiers had already vanished somewhere behind the collapsing French lines. But the more historians studied the accounts, the stranger the story became. Because the convoy did not appear to be protecting ordinary military supplies. Witnesses noticed officers carrying rolled banners wrapped in oilcloth alongside smaller boxes handled with extraordinary care. One account even described a young French soldier refusing to leave behind a damaged bronze eagle standard, despite barely being able to stand from exhaustion. To Napoleon's army, these objects represented more than wealth or military equipment. Regimental eagles, medals, flags, and battle records carried the identity of the army itself. Losing them to enemy forces was considered a humiliation that could stain a regiment forever. In many ways, these relics were the final proof that the men carrying them had once belonged to one of the most powerful armies on earth. And as the freezing darkness closed around the retreating soldiers, some officers may have reached a horrifying realization. They were not going to survive long enough to protect those symbols any further. Somewhere near that frozen hillside, beneath soil hardened by winter, a decision was made that would remain hidden for more than 200 years. The digging began sometime after midnight, while freezing wind swept across the dark hillside and snow drifted silently through the trees. Lanterns were covered with cloth to keep the light hidden from distant patrols moving along the retreat roads below. The soldiers worked in near silence, except for the sound of metal shovels striking frozen earth that had hardened like stone beneath the winter cold. Every few minutes the men stopped to listen. Somewhere far off in the darkness came the faint echo of artillery, followed by the nervous stamping of exhausted horses struggling to remain upright after weeks on the march. The officers supervising the operation appeared desperate to finish before dawn. According to one surviving account written years later by a local farmer, the French soldiers looked less like conquerors and more like men already haunted by the knowledge that they would never see home again. Their uniforms were torn and stiff with ice. Many no longer wore proper gloves. One officer reportedly wrapped his hands in strips of cloth before kneeling beside an open crate partially buried in snow. Inside were objects carefully layered beneath canvas and straw, as though someone had prepared them for a long sleep underground. A bronze eagle standard rested beside bundles of documents, tied with faded ribbon. Nearby lay ceremonial pistols, silver medallions, engraved compasses, and folded regimental banners darkened by moisture and smoke from months of campaigning. One witness claimed several soldiers removed their hats before lowering the objects into the pit, almost as if they were attending a funeral. That detail would later disturb historians more than anything else, because it suggested the burial was deeply symbolic. These were not random supplies discarded during retreat. The men were preserving something they believed represented the soul of their regiment. In Napoleon's army, the regimental eagle carried enormous emotional weight. Inspired by the standards of ancient Rome, each bronze eagle symbolized honor, sacrifice, and loyalty to the empire. Soldiers swore oaths before them. Men died protecting them during battle. Losing one to enemy forces was considered an unforgivable disgrace. As the retreat from Russia descended into catastrophe, many officers feared their units would soon cease to exist entirely. Some regiments had already lost most of their men to starvation, disease, exposure, and constant attacks along the frozen roads westward. Entire formations vanished between one village and the next. Under those conditions, protecting the regimental relics may have become more important than protecting themselves. The soldiers digging into that frozen hillside were likely making a final decision no officer ever wanted to face. If they could not save the army, perhaps they could at least save its memory. Yet something about the burial remained strange, even by the desperate standards of the retreat. Archaeologists later discovered the objects had been arranged in a precise order, beneath layers of timber and cloth, almost as if the men expected someone specific to recover them in the future. Several crates also appeared to be missing entirely, suggesting the soldiers may have separated certain items before the burial began. What those missing objects were remains unknown. But as dawn slowly approached over the frozen forests of Eastern Europe, the exhausted men finished covering the pit with dirt and snow, leaving behind a secret that would disappear with them into the endless white horizon. When the burial was finished, the soldiers did not celebrate or speak with relief. According to later accounts, many simply stood motionless beside the frozen hillside as snow slowly covered the disturbed earth behind them. One officer reportedly stared at the ground for several seconds before quietly removing the gold braid from his torn uniform sleeve and placing it into the pit, moments before it was sealed forever. Whatever had just been hidden beneath the soil clearly meant more to these men than simple military property. And for some of them, leaving it behind may have felt like burying the final remains of the army they once believed could conquer all of Europe. As the exhausted column prepared to continue westward before sunrise, conditions along the retreat road continued to deteriorate by the hour. Temperatures plunged lower each night, while thousands of starving soldiers crowded narrow roads already blocked with shattered wagons, abandoned artillery, and frozen livestock. Fires were dangerous because they attracted attention, yet without them, many men could not survive the darkness. Witnesses described soldiers sleeping shoulder to shoulder beneath carts or inside ruined barns, while snow drifted through broken roofs overhead. Some woke to discover entire groups had disappeared during the night, after wandering away in blizzards searching for food or shelter. The army was no longer moving as a unified force. It was dissolving into fragments. Yet among the chaos, several surviving records suggest a small group of officers remained obsessed with one specific fear. Not fear of death, but fear that the relics they buried might still be discovered by enemy forces before French troops could someday recover them. Historians uncovered fragments of correspondence mentioning sealed instructions carried by a courier attached to the convoy. The documents hinted that detailed notes about the burial site may have existed somewhere beyond the battlefield itself. One report referred cryptically to a second location farther west, where additional items were supposedly transported under separate guard. That single detail transformed the entire mystery, because it suggested the frozen hillside may have held only part of whatever the soldiers were trying to preserve. By this point in the retreat, rumors spread constantly through the ranks. Some men believed hidden imperial funds were being moved secretly through the collapsing army. Others whispered that elite officers were protecting battle honors and confidential records that Napoleon could not afford to lose. A few even claimed sacred regimental relics, carried since the earliest victories of the empire, were now hidden somewhere among the retreating columns. Most of those stories were likely exaggerated by fear and exhaustion. But modern archaeologists would later discover evidence that at least some of the rumors may have contained fragments of truth. Several artifacts recovered from the excavation site belonged to different regiments entirely, units that normally would not have traveled together under ordinary military conditions. That discovery suggested desperate officers may have combined their remaining valuables into one final convoy as the army collapsed around them. Somewhere along the retreat route, men from different corners of the empire had gathered their last surviving symbols of identity and entrusted them to a burial hidden beneath snow and darkness. Then, almost as suddenly as they appeared, the soldiers vanished back into the frozen wilderness. Some likely continued westward toward the remnants of Napoleon's shattered army. Others may never have escaped the forests surrounding the burial site at all. But over time, the men disappeared from history, while the secret beneath the hillside remained perfectly silent, waiting beneath frozen soil as Europe slowly forgot they had ever been there. By the second week after the burial, the retreat had become something far worse than a military withdrawal. Entire stretches of road disappeared beneath blowing snow, while exhausted soldiers wandered through forests, searching for units that no longer existed. The once disciplined formations of Napoleon's empire had dissolved into scattered groups moving westward through endless cold, with little food, almost no shelter, and growing panic spreading through the ranks. Men traded medals for bread. Officers abandoned wagons that could no longer move through the frozen mud beneath the snow. Horses collapsed beside artillery pieces that would never fire again. Yet despite the chaos swallowing the army from every direction, the mystery surrounding the buried relics only deepened. Historians studying surviving French records discovered references to a courier detachment that vanished shortly after leaving the burial site. The group reportedly carried sealed orders and partial maps linked to the hidden cache. One military ledger listed the names of 3 officers assigned to escort what was described only as the preserved regimental property. Days later, all 3 names disappeared from official reports entirely. No confirmed graves were ever identified. No surviving witness ever explained what happened to them after the retreat crossed westward beyond the forests. That silence became one of the strangest parts of the entire story. In most military disasters, at least fragments of testimony survive. Letters are written, diaries appear. Survivors speak years later. But concerning the buried relics, almost everything vanished together. Modern researchers believe that may not have been accidental. As Napoleon's army collapsed, many surviving officers feared enemy forces were capturing military records capable of exposing troop movements, financial routes, and the remaining structure of the shattered imperial command. Some historians now suspect the hidden crates may have contained more than ceremonial objects alone. Inside the excavation site, archaeologists uncovered traces of burned parchment mixed among the preserved artifacts, suggesting certain documents were deliberately destroyed before burial, while others were hidden intact. That discovery raised a disturbing possibility. The soldiers digging into the frozen hillside may have been trying to erase part of the army's secrets while preserving another part for the future. Local folklore from nearby villages only added to the mystery. For generations, families told stories about strange lights moving through the forests during the winter retreat. Some claimed French officers returned secretly months later searching for something buried beneath the snow, only to disappear again without explanation. Others spoke of villagers stumbling across abandoned military camps containing symbols of imperial regiments carved into trees beside the road. One story described a lone rider arriving in the middle of the night, asking for directions back toward the frozen hillside before vanishing into a blizzard and never returning. Historians long dismissed such accounts as exaggerated legends created after the war. But when archaeologists compared those stories with surviving military maps, several details unexpectedly aligned with known retreat routes used during Napoleon's withdrawal from Russia. Even stranger, the excavation site itself revealed signs that someone may have attempted to reopen part of the burial decades after the original event. Disturbed soil layers suggested a partial dig occurred sometime during the 19th century, before the location was abandoned again. Whoever returned there may have recovered something from beneath the earth. Or perhaps they arrived too late, unable to find what the dying soldiers had hidden beneath the frozen ground, while Europe's greatest army disappeared into snow and silence. As winter tightened its grip across Eastern Europe, the trail left behind by the retreating soldiers slowly vanished beneath layer after layer of snow. Villages burned their remaining firewood just to survive the cold, while abandoned cannons disappeared into frozen rivers and forests swallowed entire sections of the old military roads. Within weeks, the hillside where the relics had been hidden became almost impossible to recognize. The shallow tracks left by wagons disappeared. Footprints froze over. Even the trees surrounding the burial site became buried beneath heavy white drifts that transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable. And with every passing mile westward, fewer men remained alive who actually knew where the cache had been hidden. Historians now believe this was the moment the secret truly began to die. Among the surviving fragments of military correspondence discovered decades later in French archives was a damaged report mentioning a final regrouping point near the Berezina River. The document described officers attempting to reorganize remnants of shattered regiments, while thousands of exhausted soldiers crowded the frozen crossings, hoping to escape before enemy forces closed in. Witnesses wrote of endless confusion, collapsing wagons, missing units, and officers desperately searching for men who had vanished somewhere behind the retreat lines days earlier. Within that chaos, the small group connected to the hidden relics appears to have completely disappeared from military command records. Their names simply stop appearing. No promotions, no death notices, no confirmed survivors. For 2 centuries, historians debated whether this meant the men perished during the retreat or intentionally concealed their identities afterward. Some researchers believe at least one courier carrying burial information may have survived long enough to reach France. A faded memoir written in the 1840s by a former cavalry officer described hearing rumors about the lost standards buried beneath the eastern snow. Another account mentioned an imperial officer who spent years after the war quietly searching for maps connected to missing regimental property from the Russian campaign. But none of the stories provided exact locations, and over time the details blurred together into legend. Napoleon himself eventually returned to France with only a fraction of the army that had marched triumphantly eastward months earlier. The campaign became one of the greatest disasters in military history. Entire regiments ceased to exist. Thousands of records disappeared forever. And across Europe, people became less interested in forgotten relics buried somewhere beneath frozen forests than in the collapse of the empire itself. New wars followed. New borders appeared. Generations passed. Yet, in remote villages near the old retreat routes, strange stories continued to survive. Farmers occasionally uncovered rusted military buttons while plowing frozen fields in spring. Children found old coins stamped with imperial eagles near riverbanks after storms washed away layers of dirt. In one village, locals claimed church bells once rang after a hunter stumbled across half-buried crates hidden deep in the woods, before authorities arrived and sealed the area without explanation. Most of these stories were impossible to verify, but together they created an eerie pattern stretching across decades. It was as though fragments of the lost convoy kept resurfacing from beneath the earth, refusing to disappear completely. Then came the strangest discovery of all. During the modern excavation, archaeologists found traces of a second hidden compartment beneath the main burial site. Unlike the upper cache filled with ceremonial relics and regimental objects, this lower chamber had been emptied long ago. Wooden supports had collapsed inward around a hollow space large enough to hold several additional crates. Whatever had once rested there was gone. And that single discovery changed everything. Because it meant someone may have returned to the frozen hillside long before modern historians ever arrived, taking part of the secret with them, while leaving the rest buried beneath 2 centuries of silence. The discovery of the empty lower chamber transformed the excavation from a forgotten battlefield recovery into something far more unsettling. Archaeologists originally believed they had uncovered the complete burial left behind during the retreat, but the hollow space beneath the preserved relics suggested a second story hidden underneath the first. Someone had reached the site before modern historians ever arrived, and whoever it was had known exactly where to dig. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Beneath the collapsed timber supports, researchers found traces of old excavation marks buried deep below later soil layers. Rusted fragments of primitive digging tools were also discovered near the edge of the chamber, along with pieces of lantern glass dating back to the mid-19th century. That meant the hidden compartment was likely reopened decades after Napoleon's retreat, but long before modern archaeology existed. The question was who returned there, and more importantly, what they took away. As news of the excavation spread through academic circles, historians began re-examining old records and forgotten regional folklore that had once been dismissed as fantasy. In archives across France, Poland, Belarus, and Lithuania, scattered references to the missing convoy suddenly attracted new attention. One particularly strange account came from an aging French veteran interviewed in 1843, who claimed a former imperial officer spent years searching Eastern Europe for the buried honor of the army. Another memoir described rumors that certain regimental standards lost during the retreat had not actually been captured by enemy forces, but hidden intentionally by officers sworn to secrecy. Even more disturbing were the stories preserved by local families living near the excavation site itself. For generations, villagers spoke of strangers arriving quietly during harsh winters, asking unusual questions about old battlefields and abandoned roads buried beneath the forests. Some carried faded military maps. Others paid locals for information about symbols carved into ancient trees or unusual metal objects found in frozen fields after spring thaws. One legend described a man in a dark military coat appearing sometime during the 1860s and hiring workers to dig near the hillside for several nights before abruptly disappearing without explanation. At the time, most people assumed he was searching for hidden gold left behind during the retreat, but modern archaeologists now suspect he may have been searching for something entirely different. Because among the artifacts recovered from the burial site, researchers uncovered evidence suggesting at least one item of enormous symbolic importance was missing from the cache altogether. The dimensions of the empty compartment matched almost perfectly with the size of a regimental eagle case used during Napoleon's campaigns. If true, that meant the most valuable object buried beneath the hillside may have been removed long before the rest of the relics were rediscovered. Historians immediately began debating the implications. Did a surviving officer secretly return years later to recover the symbol of his regiment? Did treasure hunters stumble upon the cache by accident during the 19th century? Or had the imperial government itself quietly sent agents eastward after the wars to retrieve certain sensitive objects before they could fall into foreign hands? No definitive answer exists. Yet the mystery surrounding the missing chamber created an eerie possibility that some part of the secret never remained buried at all. Somewhere across Europe, hidden in a private collection, forgotten attic, or sealed museum archive, an object connected to the vanished convoy may still exist today, separated from the frozen hillside where exhausted soldiers once buried the final remains of their collapsing empire beneath the winter snow. What finally emerged from the frozen hillside stunned even the historians who had spent years studying Napoleon's disastrous retreat. As archaeologists carefully expanded the excavation around the collapsed burial chamber, more objects began appearing beneath layers of dark soil preserved by 2 centuries of cold. A silver officer's watch still rested inside a leather pouch hardened by time. Fragments of blue military cloth clung to rusted buttons stamped with imperial symbols. Nearby lay several bundles of handwritten documents wrapped tightly in waxed fabric, preserved just enough for faded ink to remain visible beneath the dirt. But it was one discovery in particular that changed the entire understanding of the burial site forever. Buried beneath timber planks near the rear of the chamber, researchers uncovered a sealed wooden case bearing the nearly invisible outline of a French imperial eagle burned into the lid. The box itself had partially collapsed with age, but traces of velvet lining remained inside, along with fragments of gold embroidery and small bronze fittings believed to belong to a ceremonial regimental standard. The eagle itself was gone, Yet the empty impressions left behind matched perfectly with the dimensions of military standards carried by Napoleon's elite regiments during the early 19th century. For the first time, historians had physical evidence suggesting the soldiers at the hillside had indeed buried some of the most sacred symbols in the French army. Even more remarkable was the condition of the artifacts themselves. Because the soil remained frozen for much of the year, many objects survived in extraordinary detail. One recovered medallion still displayed scratches likely made during the retreat itself. A cracked compass preserved traces of folded paper hidden inside the casing, possibly used for navigation during the withdrawal westward. Archaeologists also discovered several personal belongings mixed among the military relics, including a small religious cross, gaming dice carved from bone, and a pocket notebook containing the faint remains of names written in French beside dates from the campaign. These details transformed the excavation from a simple military discovery into something deeply human. The buried objects no longer felt like anonymous artifacts from a distant war. They felt like the final possessions of exhausted men, trying desperately to preserve pieces of their identity while the world around them collapsed. Yet the deeper researchers investigated the burial, the stranger the mystery became. Several documents recovered from the site referenced officers and units that official military records claimed were destroyed long before reaching the region where the cache was hidden. One partially preserved page even mentioned a planned rendezvous farther west involving the remaining standards and archives. Historians immediately questioned whether additional hidden sites connected to the convoy might still exist somewhere along the retreat route. Ground scanning technology later detected unusual underground formations deeper within the surrounding forest, though no major excavation has yet been completed there. That possibility reignited centuries-old rumors about lost imperial relics scattered across Eastern Europe after the collapse of Napoleon's army. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came from the burial chamber itself. Near the edge of the excavation, archaeologists uncovered several footprints preserved beneath compressed soil layers created during the original burial. Analysis suggested multiple men stood motionless near the pit for an extended period before departing westward together. No signs indicated they ever returned. For a brief moment frozen beneath 200 years of earth and snow, the final moments of those forgotten soldiers had survived almost exactly as they left them, silent witnesses to an empire vanishing into the winter darkness. Long after the excavation teams packed away their equipment and the historians returned to museums and archives, the frozen hillside remained exactly where it had always been, silent beneath the forests of Eastern Europe. Snow still covered the ground each winter, just as it had during the retreat of 1812. Wind still moved through the same dark trees where exhausted soldiers once stood beneath hidden lantern light, listening to distant cannon fire, while they buried the last symbols of a dying army beneath the frozen earth. Yet despite everything uncovered at the site, the most important questions were never fully answered. No surviving document has ever explained exactly why those men chose that specific hillside. No official report reveals who ordered the burial. And perhaps most unsettling of all, historians still do not know what disappeared from the lower chamber before modern archaeologists arrived. Somewhere between the collapse of Napoleon's retreat and the rediscovery of the relics more than 2 centuries later, part of the secret vanished forever. Some researchers believe the missing objects may have included one of the imperial eagles carried during the Russian campaign, symbols considered so sacred that soldiers often risked everything to protect them from capture. Others suspect confidential records connected to the final movements of Napoleon's shattered command structure may have once rested inside the hidden chamber before being removed decades later by unknown hands. But there is another theory that continues to haunt historians studying the site. According to several military historians, the burial may never have been intended as a temporary hiding place at all. The arrangement of the relics, the care taken to preserve them beneath timber and cloth, and the symbolic objects placed beside them all suggest something closer to a memorial than a cache. It is possible the soldiers digging into the frozen ground already understood they were not coming back. The burial may have been their final act as a regiment, a desperate attempt to preserve the memory of who they once were before the retreat erased them from history. And in many ways, it worked, because while the empire itself collapsed long ago, the objects hidden beneath that hillside survived long enough to tell part of their story. A cracked compass, a faded regimental banner, a watch frozen in time beneath layers of ice and earth. Small fragments of ordinary lives carried through one of history's greatest military disasters. Yet even now, the mystery refuses to disappear completely. Ground scans around the excavation site continue to reveal strange underground formations deeper within the surrounding forest. Historians still debate whether additional burial sites connected to the convoy may remain hidden somewhere beneath the old retreat routes stretching westward through Eastern Europe. And scattered across museums and private collections throughout Europe are unidentified Napoleonic relics with missing origins, objects that may once have belonged to the vanished convoy itself. Perhaps the strangest detail of all is this. During the final week of excavation, one archaeologist reportedly noticed a faint carving on a timber fragment recovered from the lower chamber. Nearly erased by time, the mark appeared to show the outline of an imperial eagle beside a single unfinished word in French. The translation was simple: remember. No one knows who carved it. No one knows whether the missing relics were ever fully recovered. And somewhere beneath the endless forests and frozen soil of Eastern Europe, the final secret carried by those retreating soldiers may still remain buried in darkness, waiting silently beneath the snow exactly where they left it more than 200 years ago.